31-year-old Linda Slaten lived in Lakeland, Florida. She had two sons, 12-year-old Tim and 15-year-old Jeff. On the morning of September 4th of 1981, Linda's sister Judy Butler had gone to their home so the two could have coffee. But when she arrived, Judy found her sister's body and quickly called 911. Linda was laying on the bed with a wire hanger wrapped around her neck. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators who arrived at the scene had to break the news to her two sons. They found Jeff sleeping in the living room and told him to put on some clothes and go outside. Once outside, Jeff saw what looked like every cop in the state of Florida, news crews, and his Aunt Judy was out there crying. Judy then told him what had happened to Linda. In the second bedroom, an officer woke up Linda's other son, Tim. Still in his pajamas, Tim walked past his mother's closed bedroom door. The door then swung open as an officer left the room. He then saw the whole crime scene. Investigators believed that the perpetrator entered Linda's bedroom window as the screen had been removed. They also found a palm print on the windowsill. Furthermore, they were able to collect DNA belonging to an unknown man from her body. Investigators then tried to learn more about Linda to try to find if the person responsible was someone close to her. They looked at Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slaten. She divorced him in 1974 when she was 24 years old. He was a violent alcoholic and would turn abusive and hit Linda. Even though he was an asshole, investigators could not link him to the crime. Another person investigators looked at was Jeff Slaten. They interviewed him a few times but could not prove that he was responsible either. Investigators also looked into Joe Mills. 20-year-old Mills was Tim's football coach at school. After getting divorced, Linda struggled for work, made her own clothes to save money, and could not afford a car. Mills then drove Tim to and from practice every day. Investigators could not link Mills to the crime scene either. Sergeant Edgar Pickett worked at the Lakeland Police Department as a fingerprint expert. He scoured the entire crime scene and was the one that found the palm print on the windowsill. The palm print and the DNA taken from Linda's body was stored so it could be used at a later date. Jeff and Tim moved in with their grandparents, Clarence and Margaret Harris. They were terrified and almost never left the house. They all slept in the same room except Grandpa Harris. He would stand guard with a gun all night while they slept. The grandparents hoped a quick return to familiar routines would help their distraught grandsons. A few weeks after their mom's funeral, the boys were back in school. They decided to focus on football. This is a photo of Tim's football team, taken a month after Linda's life was taken. Tim hung the photo in his bedroom. He said it reminded him of something his mom taught him, to keep moving forward and never giving up. In recent years, Jeff and Tim stated that there is still grief and guilt for not hearing anything that night, for not coming to their mom's rescue. In March of 1999, investigators had developed a full DNA profile of the person that took Linda's life. All they needed was a match. Detective Brad Grice took over the case in 2001. He took dozens of DNA samples from prior persons of interest, submitting them to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for comparison. Detective Grice then met with Jeff and Tim. He took DNA samples from the brothers to clear them again. He also promised them that he would not retire until he solved their mother's case. Frank Slaten, who had stopped drinking, also volunteered a sample, but none matched. Then, in September 2001, Detective Grice got a tip. Nearly a year after Linda's life was taken, a 24-year-old man named Jimmy Ulmer pulled a 10-year-old girl through her bedroom window and nearly took her life. Ulmer was convicted of that and sentenced to 80 years in prison. The savage assault seemed eerily similar to Linda's case. Furthermore, Detective Grice discovered that around the time Linda's life was ended, Jimmy Ulmer had been staying with a friend who happened to live in the very same apartment complex as Linda. Detective Grice, along with Jeff and Tim, felt confident that they had their man. Ulmer passed away in prison in 1996, but Grice got a DNA sample from his mother. When his DNA did not match the DNA from the crime scene, it was a massive disappointment. It felt like they were back to square one. By 2005, Detective Grice was headed up to a new cold case unit and got the FBI to run the DNA profile continuously through all federal databanks. But the years continued to pass without a match. In 2015, Detective Grice had medical problems which forced him to retire, meaning he unfortunately couldn't keep his promise. All hope was not lost, however, as in 2018, groundbreaking DNA technology began to electrify the law enforcement community. Genetic genealogist Cece Moore decided to take on Linda's case. She is a renowned expert in the field of investigative genetic genealogy. Cece has been responsible for solving so many cold cases, many of which have been covered on this channel. Moore uploaded the DNA profile to a public genealogy website called GED Match. She then meticulously constructed branch by branch the culprit's family tree. She made these connections by poring over birth certificates, marriage license, obituaries, and social media to fill in the family tree with names. Moore explained that she uncovered 3 branches of the perpetrator's family tree that ultimately narrowed to the one person most likely responsible. She said that the 3 genetic networks converged into one family tree that pointed at one immediate family. The man was the only son in that family, so it had to be him. That was the DNA contributor. After hundreds of leads and dead ends, after dozens of suspects were investigated and cleared, Cece Moore identified the man in one weekend. The man is Joseph Clinton Mills, Coach Joe, who drove Tim to and from practice. Authorities wanted to be certain before they notified the brothers. Cece Moore's final 2019 report confirmed that Joseph Mills, then 58, was living in Kathleen, Florida, about a half an hour from the crime scene. Detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley were the next generation of Lakeland investigators who worked on Linda's case. The detectives then combed over the original case files and learned that Mills was interviewed initially, but just briefly. Mills told them that he dropped Tim off at his house and that he did not know what happened to Linda. Detectives found that Mills was convicted in 1984 of grand theft for forging a will. He never went to jail, but he was fingerprinted and had a palm print taken as well. In August of 2019, investigators compared those prints to the palm print Sergeant Pickett lifted off Linda's windowsill nearly 38 years before. It was a match. High-tech genetic genealogy had identified Mills as the likely culprit, and an old-fashioned palm print helped confirm his identity. Detective Hathcock and Hurley still needed to compare a fresh DNA sample from Mills to the decades-old DNA recovered from the crime scene. They covertly took Mills's trash back to the police department. They discovered a piece of used medical adhesive tape and sent it off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab for testing. 11 days later, the tests came back, and it was confirmed that Joseph Mills took the life of Linda Slaten. Only then could her sons Jeff and Tim be informed that the monster had finally been caught. Tim said he had looked up to Coach Joe and was now sickened that he had this photo of him all these years. Even more sickening was that Mills continued driving Tim to and from practice after he took Linda's life. On December 12th of 2019, detectives arrested Joseph Mills. Here's a picture of Detective Tammy Hathcock reading him his rights. He showed no emotion and didn't ask why he was being arrested, almost as if he already knew. After the arrest, Tim and Jeff went to meet Sergeant Edgar Pickett, now 94 years old, to personally thank him for collecting the palm print all those years back. In 2022, Mills pled guilty to all charges. At his sentencing, Linda's family wanted to know why. Jeff yelled at him in court, "Why? I just want to know why, Joe. Why'd you take my mama from me? I loved my mama. We was happy." Mills's response infuriated everyone. "I am a good person. I'm not that person that they're painting me out to be." Finally, in February of 2022, Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. C.C. Moore said, "We owe a huge debt of gratitude to those original crime scene investigators. Because at the time this crime was committed, they didn't even know DNA was going to be used in criminal investigations. And so the fact they collected that and then it was stored responsibly and carefully all these years by that department is so important. If that hadn't happened, we couldn't have done our work." Jeff and Tim say they're determined to move on the best they can, to live life well for their mom and for their families. The brothers also know they never would have survived their ordeal without each other. They remain extremely close, live just a few miles apart, and share passionate hobbies like restoring cars. Jeff and Tim visit their mom's grave together often and burn a candle next to a portrait of her every anniversary. 36-year-old Flora Stevens lived in Sullivan County, New York in 1975. She was an employee at the Concord Hotel and was married to Robert Stevens. On August 3rd of 1975, Robert dropped her off for a doctor's appointment at the Community General Hospital, located in Monticello, New York. When Robert returned to pick her up, she had vanished. He reported her missing after he was unable to find her. Detectives periodically reviewed the case to find Flora, but were never able to develop leads. On September 15th of 2017, the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office was contacted by a New York State Police investigator who said a set of unidentified skeletal remains were found in southern Orange County. The woman whose body had been dumped roughly matched Flora's general characteristics, and the investigator was hoping that any living relatives could provide DNA for identification. Instead, investigators discovered someone was using Flora's social security number in Massachusetts. Detectives tracked down the social security number to an assisted living facility in Lowell, Massachusetts. Staff at the facility confirmed that the number belonged to Flora Harris, who had been at the facility since 2001. Investigators decided to go talk to 78-year-old Flora, but found she suffers from dementia and is unable to speak more than 1 or 2 words at a time. She did recognize her ID from the Concord Hotel as her own. Officials were able to trace Flora's medical records back about 30 years and learned she spent time in a nursing home in New Hampshire and at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan. Unfortunately, because of her illness, it is still a mystery how and why she disappeared from Monticello in 1975 and where she went. Frustratingly, authorities have been unable to locate any living relatives. When showed a picture of her younger self, Flora said, "Me?" And when showed a picture of her husband, Robert, she said, "Robert." This confirmed to investigators that Flora Stevens and Flora Harris is the same person. Speaking of Robert, he unfortunately never found out what happened to his wife, and he is not alive anymore. Gabriel Nagy lived in Sydney, Australia with his wife Pamela, his son Stephen, and his daughter Jennifer. Gabriel immigrated to Australia with his parents when he was a young boy and loved living there. He He was a devoted father and had a family that respected him and could not imagine anything ever getting between them. But unfortunately, something did. Gabriel worked as a shop fitter. He helped companies build retail spaces around the city. He wanted to be an accountant, however, and was taking classes to achieve his dream. On January 21st of 1987, Gabriel went into the city to run some errands. He called his wife Pamela to tell her that he would be home for lunch. Pamela made food for him and waited for her husband, but he never came home. She waited until she received a call that changed her life forever. The police had found the burned-out shell of Gabriel's car on the side of the road. There was no sign of him to be found. Pamela and her 2 children started putting out missing persons flyers all over Sydney. Surely, someone had to know what happened to Gabriel after the car accident. Unfortunately, no one knew. 2 weeks after Gabriel disappeared, the police determined that he withdrew money from a bank in the city of Newcastle. Newcastle is about 100 miles away from Sydney. His family was hopeful about the new lead and believed this would help them find Gabriel. The lead turned into a dead end, however, and the case went cold for 2 more decades. There was a senior constable by the name of Georgia Robinson. She promised herself that she would solve this case. In her last attempt at finding Gabriel, she did just that in 2012. She looked through some files when she came across something interesting. The Medicare system in Australia showed documents that a person named Gabriel Nagy recently underwent eye surgery. The records also showed that the man went by another name, Ron Saunders. Constable Robinson called this man. He told her that the last 2 decades of his life was fuzzy, to say the least. He spent most of his time homeless, just wandering from city to city. That was until a pastor by the name of Barry Hayo came across Gabriel. The pastor gave Gabriel a job at the church as a caretaker. Gabriel got the name Ron Saunders from a sign for the Queensland Saunders Beach while he was wandering around. His memory slowly came back, so when he got the eye surgery, he gave the name of Gabriel Nagy as well. Robinson flew to where Gabriel was currently living and showed him pictures of his family. More and more of his memory started to come back. The car accident Gabriel was in left him with a serious head injury. He then fell into a fugue state which led him to forget everything about his life. Gabriel described the situation as unreal. He still didn't fully remember his family. He vowed to keep in touch, but he couldn't bring himself to move back in with his family. This is a photograph of Pamela and their daughter Jennifer with the photo album they showed Gabriel. And here's a picture of Gabriel and Jennifer when they first saw each other again in 2012. Carlina White was born on July 16th of 1987 in New York City to parents Joy White and Carl Tyson. On August 4th, 1987, when Carlina was 19 days old, her parents took her to the hospital since she had a fever. A woman that was dressed as a nurse had comforted the parents at the hospital, but was in fact not a hospital employee. Her name is Ann Petway. Petway came up with the idea to pretend to be a nurse at the hospital so that she could abduct a baby. She had a series of miscarriages and came to the realization that she could not conceive. At 2:30 a.m. in the morning, after Carlina's parents brought her to the hospital, Petway removed Carlina's IV line and abducted her. The hospital had video surveillance, but at the time it was not working. Thus, the only description of the woman came from Joy White and Carl Tyson. A guard said that a woman matching the description left the hospital at 3:30 a.m. and that no infant was visible, but the baby could have been covered up. The abduction of Carlina White became known as the very first known infant abduction from a New York hospital. Carlina was raised as Nedra Natty Nance by Petway in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This was about 45 miles from where her parents lived. Carlina attended Thomas Hooker School and graduated from Warren Harding High School. Petway and Carlina later moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Carlina did grow suspicious in her teens that Petway was not her biological mother because she was not able to provide a birth certificate. In 2005, Carlina was pregnant. She asked Petway to give her the birth certificate so that she could apply for health insurance. Petway then obtained a forged Connecticut birth certificate. When Carlina attempted to use it, the officials told her that it was a forged document. When confronted by Carlina, Petway finally confessed that she was not her biological mother. Petway did not tell the entire truth, however. She told Carlina that she had been abandoned by a drug addict. When Carlina was 23 years old, she used websites such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There, she found images of the kidnapped Carlina White that resembled infant photos of herself as Nedra and those of her daughter, Simani. Carlina decided to call the center's hotline and was able to get into contact with her birth family. In January of 2011, DNA tests confirmed that she was the missing Carlina White. After the confirmation that Nedra Nance was really Carlina White, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began a search for Ann Petway. Petway turned herself into the FBI office at Bridgeport on the morning of January 23rd of 2011. Petway confessed and told federal investigators that she kidnapped Carlina after enduring several miscarriages because of the stress over whether she would ever be able to be a parent. On July 30th of 2012, 50-year-old Ann Petway was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge said that she was selfish and inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on a couple. Petway served her sentence in the Federal Correctional Institution, Aliceville in Alabama, until she was released on April 14th of 2021. Carlina's reunion with her parents was not so smooth. There were conflicts about money, the fact that Carlina still wanted to be called Nettie, and her love for Ann Petway. But with the last public updates, it does fortunately seem like Carlina made peace with her parents and they are all on good terms. Nguyen Thi was a 16-year-old student living in Hanoi, Vietnam in 1992. Nguyen was very beautiful and got the attention of a lot of boys. This led her to not focus on her studies at all, and she spent most of her time out with her friends. One such evening, she arrived home after curfew, and her mother refused to open the door for her. That night, Nguyen disappeared. Her mother, Vu Thi Ha, regretted what she did greatly. She was quoted as saying, "At the time I thought that my daughter was corrupted. Today, it is not so serious." After being refused into her home, Nguyen went to a karaoke bar with her friends where she met a woman called Tan. This woman led Nguyen and her friends to a bar near the Chinese-Vietnam border. They spent the night drinking and singing. The next morning, Nguyen woke up and was shocked to learn that she and her friends were held captive in a house in China. The woman forced Nguyen and her 3 friends to marry Chinese men of around 70 and 80 years old. When Nguyen refused, she was punished. Eventually, Nguyen was introduced to 5 men for her to marry. One of them was 40 years old. She married the man that was 40, as she was scared about what they were going to do to her if she refused them at all. A year later, she had a child with her husband and learned that the house they lived in was situated in the Guangdong province. Nguyen tried to run away twice, and both times she failed. After the failure of her third attempt, she was chained for 2 weeks. Nguyen met a Vietnamese driver who worked at a farm near her house. She begged him to help her after she told him the whole story. The driver came up with the idea of putting her in a cage with pigs in the back of his truck to make sure she was not seen. They drove for 70 miles before taking a cab. They kept moving to the Vietnam-China border for another 100 miles. After saying goodbye to the cab driver, the truck driver and Nguyen traveled for 3 more months on their way to the border. At the border, they met a taxi driver who took them over the border for free since they had no money. Once entering Vietnam, Nguyen was scared that her family had passed away. This was now 21 years after she disappeared. The truck driver told Nguyen, however, if your parents passed away and your family does not accept you, you can come back and live with me. With that reassurance, Nguyen went to look for her family. She asked many people for help since Hanoi changed so much since she had left. In a surprise twist, the 6th person she asked was her very own uncle. They did not recognize each other until Nguyen told him she was Miss Ha's daughter. Her uncle dropped the bundle of vegetables he was carrying and ran to his sister's house. At first, she did not believe him until she saw her long-lost daughter with her own eyes. Data from Vietnam's Ministry of Public Security shows that since 2010, there have been over 3,000 cases of human trafficking involving almost 7,000 victims, mostly women and children from poor and rural areas. A majority were sold to men seeking wives in China, Malaysia, and South Korea, or just to simply bear children. China rescued more than 1,100 women trafficked into the country, many of them sold as brides, in a joint operation with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam between July and December of 2018. Petra Pazsitka was a 24-year-old computer science student at the Braunschweig University in Germany. On July 26th of 1984, she visited her dentist and then went to a shop to buy a printer cartridge that she planned to give to her younger brother Karsten for his birthday. Petra also told her neighbor Misha to water her plants while she is away. She planned on visiting her parents in Wolfsburg for the holidays. Petra informed her parents how she is looking forward to be there for the holidays, finishing her schoolwork and looking after her younger brother. Her family was excited for Petra to come home, but unfortunately, she never did. At first, they thought that she stayed longer at the university, but there were no signs of her there. 2 days later, when she missed Karsten's birthday party, her parents reported her missing. A massive police search then ensued. Her disappearance was featured on TV as well, but no leads came in. There was not much to go on for the police, and the case went cold. In 1985, a 19-year-old carpenter's apprentice, simply known as Gunter K., confessed to ending the lives of both Petra and a 14-year-old. The police did not believe his story, however, and found that he had nothing to do with Petra's disappearance. In September of 2015, 31 years after Petra disappeared, there was finally a breakthrough in the case. The police were called to an apartment in Dusseldorf belonging to a 55-year-old woman by the name of Petra Schneider. She wanted to report a burglary. The police wanted to see her ID, and only then did she tell them the truth. She then admitted that she is the girl that went missing 31 years ago. She said that she carefully planned her disappearance. Even after being found, she wants no contact with her family. Since her disappearance, she had been living in various places across Germany under the name Petra Schneider. She had no passport, identity card, bank account, doctor, dentist, or insurance. Petra saved up 4,000 Deutsche Marks, equivalent to $2,000, to fund her disappearance. She avoided everyone and kept to herself mostly. If it wasn't for the burglary at her apartment, the case may never have been solved. Her family is devastated. Her father passed away a few years ago, but her brother and mother were in shock and in tears when they heard the news. The police tried to arrange a reunion between Petra and her family, but she is adamant about never wanting to see them again. Let me know in the comments section if you think Petra should have told her family she was safe after leaving. Denise Bolser was a 24-year-old woman living in Raymond, New Hampshire. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small company. On January 17th of 1985, she disappeared, and the only lead was a note that was left behind. When her husband came home, he found the note, which read, "We've got your wife." A few days after her disappearance, police found her pickup truck at Logan Airport in Boston. Her social security card, birth certificate, and credit cards were neatly organized and still in the car. Authorities pursued the theory that she may have been kidnapped, but could find no real evidence aside from the anonymous note. They later came to believe that perhaps she had left on her own accord, but her family, with whom she was very close with, believed foul play was involved. A year after she disappeared, she was indicted in absentia for embezzling $12,000 from the company that she worked for. That was all the police had to go on, and the case went cold. That was until 17 years later, in 2002. It was then that the FBI believed that they found her. She was now going by the name of Denise Jones. She was still a bookkeeper and had started a new family. 42-year-old Denise was elated to see her family when they knocked on the door. She explained that her boss wanted to end her life because of the embezzlement. Denise claimed that it was closer to $100,000 that she embezzled. The county prosecutors dropped the charges against her because her former boss was long deceased. Denise lived in South Carolina, the Bahamas, California, and Hawaii while she was missing, and lived in Florida since 1996. Her current husband was stunned, but said a lot of things that didn't make sense before did now. Denise would always be depressed on Mother's Day and out of sorts on holidays. She never talked about her family. 46-year-old Craig Williamson and 41-year-old Christine Reinhard married at Lake Tahoe, California on October 7th of 1990. It was a second marriage for both of them. Craig and Christine had known each other for only a month, but they knew from the start that they loved each other. Christine said being married to Craig is like a honeymoon. She said he is the most sincere, loving, and caring person. The two bought a farm in Clintonville, Wisconsin, Christine's home state, and undertook an immediate renovation. They added to the barn and installed large tanks and began to raise an exotic and tasty African fish called tilapia. Their plan was to get into the lucrative business of fish farming and selling the tilapia across the country. Craig specially rigged an old-school bus to transport the fish. On August 28th of 1993, Craig loaded up and set off for Colorado to sell the fish. Christine was worried about him driving because he had suffered a concussion 4 weeks earlier. He was still experiencing headaches and blurred vision. When Craig arrived in Colorado Springs, he rented a car for business appointments. At 9 p.m. on August 30th, the night before he was to return home, he and Christine spoke for the last time on the phone. Craig was 1,000 miles away from the farm in Clintonville, Wisconsin, when he disappeared in Colorado Springs. The next day, his credit cards were discovered at a market in El Paso, Texas, 675 miles south of Colorado Springs. 2 weeks later, in Juarez, Mexico, just across the border from El Paso, Craig's rental car was found abandoned. Nothing useful could be found around or inside the car. No signs pointing to where Craig was or what happened to him. There were no signs of foul play. Christine had two choices. She could either sit at home waiting for police in distant cities to call her back, or she could do something herself. Christine did something. On September 14th of 1993, Christine arrived in Colorado Springs. She put up missing persons flyers in the areas where Craig had been. Christine also visited the hotel that Craig had last been seen in. One of the employees showed her room 112 where Craig had stayed. He showed her the bathroom and said that all of Craig's stuff was there and he had a book on the sink. In the bedroom, he showed her that Craig's luggage was on the chair next to the bed. The luggage was unpacked and unopened. The bed was made and looked like it was not slept in. There was no evidence of any struggle taking place. Christine believed that Craig had been attacked the day he vanished. She believed that due to his prior injuries. He wandered off to an unknown location. Detective Robert Johnson headed the investigation in Colorado. He showed Christine the area where they found the school bus with the fish still parked. Christine theorized that Craig checked on the school bus, and then on his way to the rental car, someone came up behind him and hit him over the head. She was quoted as saying, "This is completely in keeping in character with Craig, is that he would get up and would not go in and say that I am hurt, help me. He would think that I have to get on with things, I have to be doing something, I am supposed to go somewhere and I have to get back." And he would wander toward the bright lights of the parking lot and the interchange, and he wandered off from there. The case went cold for a short while as investigators and Christine were unable to find useful leads. Then, television stations in Colorado and Wisconsin reported about Craig's disappearance and Christine's search. Within days, a retired nurse from Montana came forward to report what she had witnessed. The retired nurse is Judy Inman. She saw the coverage of Craig's disappearance on the television and recognized him. 2 weeks after Craig vanished, Judy was traveling from Montana to Washington on a train when she saw a disheveled-looking man on board. She recalled when the man first got on the train, two drunks were harassing him. She saw the man walking down the aisle, clearly looking for something. He then said he had to get back to the fish, and kept saying it over and over again. The man talked about a big building with big tanks where they kept the fish, and that the fish were not from America. Being a retired nurse, Judy Inman knew that there was something wrong with the man. She knew that he was not drunk or mentally ill. Judy was able to determine that he definitely had some sort of head injury because she had taken care of patients like that in the past. After hearing what Judy had said, Christine was convinced that the man on the train was indeed Craig, especially because of his ramblings about the fish from out of state. She also believed he was headed to Washington because they had initially met there. Christine packed up everything she would need and traveled to Washington. She also packed a bag for Craig in the outside chance that she found him. Christine set off on a 6-week odyssey, paralleling Judy Inman's train route from Whitefish, Montana to Portland, Oregon. Christine photographed all the train stations along the way and went to various locations along the train route that Judy Inman and the man were on. On December 26th of 1993, Christine met Judy Inman in person for the first time and showed her the photographs of each train station along the route. Judy believed that the man resembling Craig had gotten off at Wishram, Washington, near the Oregon border. She recognized the building because it was small and she remembered the color. Christine believed that Craig might have mistaken Wishram for Washougal. Washougal is a town that Craig had lived in during the 1980s. Craig's son went to Wishram and plastered the area with this poster, but no new clues surfaced. Unfortunately, no trace of Craig was found. Christine then talked about how difficult it was going back to the farm in Wisconsin empty-handed. It was absolutely terrible to drive back here after looking for Craig for the 6 weeks that I did. This place was so cold and empty, everywhere I looked, things reminded me of Craig all the time. I can't give up. I will never give up. I will just constantly look for him until I am no longer alive or he is found. Those are the only 2 options. I know he is alive, and I know someday I will find him. The trouble is, I do not know when, and I just have to keep hanging on. The hardest part is hanging on. Investigators suspected that Craig may have staged his disappearance based on how his credit cards were left in plain sight. They also noted that his rental car had beard clippings in it. Lab technicians determined that they had been cut with scissors, suggesting that he was changing his appearance. He had $2,500 cash with him when he vanished. He and Christine also had put all of their money into the farm and borrowed another $400,000. Finally, his bus seemed ill-equipped to bring fish back from Colorado. It had no tanks, fish food, or coolers. On May 25th of 1994, Craig's disappearance was covered on Unsolved Mysteries. They described him as a 49-year-old man, 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 190 pounds. He had gray hair and blue eyes. They also showed television footage of Craig. It was filmed in Wisconsin in February of 1993, 6 months before Craig disappeared. In a twist, Craig saw a re-airing of the broadcast and recognized himself in July of 1995. He was living in Key West, Florida. He claimed he was mugged in Colorado Springs and developed amnesia, which had worsened due to the concussion that he had suffered the month before he disappeared. Craig could not remember much else from the attack, claiming that he woke up in a hospital with the name Ron. He also claimed that he wandered aimlessly throughout the United States before arriving in the Key West, where he found a job as a diver. Craig soon contacted Christine, along with his ex-wife. Unfortunately, he did not remember Christine or his family. Nevertheless, Christine and Craig were reunited a few days later. The two later traveled to Colorado Springs, hoping that something would jog his memory. However, the trip was unsuccessful. They decided to divorce, but remained friends. Craig moved to California to stay with friends, while Christine moved to Wyoming to start a new life. Despite Craig's claims, investigators are still suspicious of his amnesia and believed that he staged his disappearance. They believe he ran away to escape debts and the responsibilities of running his new business. Do please let me know what your thoughts are about this case down below in the comments section.